A small restaurant on a Memphis street corner. Opening day. A 5-year-old girl carried a bowl of cornbread with both hands, stepping slowly toward table number 1 careful, as if she were carrying the whole world. The man sitting at that table wore a black vest, back straight, face unreadable. The kind of man who walked into a room and every conversation stopped. The little girl set the bowl down, looked up, and grinned. "Mister, my mom makes the best food ever. Try it." The man looked at the child, then picked up the spoon, then tasted, and for the first time in a long while, nodded. But 6 months ago, this man ate every dinner alone, in a penthouse above the city skyline, and never allowed anyone to sit at his table. And the woman cooking in that tiny kitchen 6 months ago, she was washing dishes at midnight in a restaurant about to shut down, without enough money in her pocket to buy milk for her daughter. So what happened? What brought the most powerful man in Memphis here to a 12-square-meter restaurant, eating cornbread from the hands of a 5-year-old? This story begins with a rainy night, an envelope full of cash, and the smell of smoked bacon and red beans in a kitchen at the end of an alley. If this story touched your heart, please hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories. We'll see you in the next episode. Sheridan's restaurant sat on the top floor of a glass building in the heart of downtown Memphis. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where the elite made reservations a month in advance just to sit down for dinner. But the people who truly understood Memphis knew Sheridan's wasn't just a restaurant, it was Knox Sheridan's territory. That evening, Knox sat at the last table in the hidden corner, the one no one was ever allowed to reserve. In front of him was a plate of pan-seared veal, an untouched glass of red wine, and a set of silver cutlery arranged with perfect precision. Knox cut a piece of meat, lifted it to his mouth, and chewed slowly. His face showed nothing at all. Perry stood 3 steps from the table, arms folded across his chest, his eyes sweeping the room out of habit. The restaurant door opened. A middle-aged man walked in, wearing a gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He looked around, saw Perry, nodded in greeting, then walked straight toward Knox's table. Perry didn't stop him. He only shifted aside just enough for the man to pass. That meant Knox had already agreed to see him. The man pulled out the chair and sat down across from Knox. He opened his mouth, but Knox was still cutting his meat, still hadn't looked up. The man hesitated, then began to speak. "Mr. Sheridan, I know it's overdue. Business hasn't been good this year. I'm only asking for 3 more months, just 3 more months, and I'll have enough." Knox kept cutting his meat. The second piece. He chewed slowly, swallowed. Then he set down his knife and fork, wiped his mouth with a white cloth napkin, folded it, and placed it to the side. He looked up for the first time since the other man had sat down. 3 months, Knox said. His voice was light, ordinary, as if he were simply repeating something from the menu. "I'll give you 3 months, but you already know this. I don't give a third time." That was all. No raised voice, no slammed fist on the table, no specific threat. But the man across from him swallowed hard, nodded over and over, and pushed back his chair to stand. "Thank you, Mr. Sheridan. I won't make you remind me." He turned and walked out, moving faster than he had when he came in. Perry escorted him all the way to the door, then came back. Knox watched until the door closed, then turned back toward his plate of meat. He cut another piece, lifted it to his mouth, chewed, then stopped. He set the knife and fork down again, but this time harder. "Perry," Perry stepped forward. "Fire the chef. This is impossible to swallow." Perry didn't look surprised. "That's the 4th one in 2 months." Knox pushed the plate away, took a sip of red wine, and set the glass down. "I don't care which number he is. I pay to eat well, not to swallow something bland." He fell silent for a while, his finger tapping lightly on the tabletop. "Don't look for another restaurant chef. Those people all cook the same. This sauce, that sauce, pretty plating, but when you eat it, there's nothing there." Knox turned to look at Perry. "Find me someone who actually knows how to cook. Someone who cooks differently. I don't need it to look beautiful. I need to swallow it and want another bite." Perry nodded. He didn't ask anything else. After 20 years at Knox's side, Perry knew when he should ask questions and when he should go do the work. This was the time to go do the work. Knox remained seated alone. The glass of red wine in front of him was still nearly full. The room was large, the yellow lights dim, and dozens of tables around him were filled with diners. But no one dared look toward the last table. The sound of knives and forks, the soft laughter and low conversations of the guests drifted steadily through the room. But around Knox's table there was always a silence of its own, as if the air there were thicker than everywhere else. Knox took another sip of wine, then stood. He buttoned his suit jacket, straightened his sleeves, and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. The server standing by the door bowed his head in greeting. Knox didn't nod, didn't look, only walked past. That was Knox Sheridan, the man whose name everyone in Memphis knew, but no one wanted to say after dark. Perry didn't sleep that night. Not because Knox's words had made him uneasy. After 20 years walking beside that man, Perry was used to short commands and never asking twice. But this time was different. Don't look for another restaurant chef. Find someone who cooks differently. Different how? Perry drove past 3 diners through the night. The first was downtown, with passable food, the kind of self-serve buffet meant for office workers heading home late. The second was near Beale Street, packed with tourists, blues music blasting too loudly, the food heavily seasoned but rushed. Perry ate a few bites, then left. There was nothing worth bringing back to Knox. Close to 1 o'clock in the morning, Perry drove down to the Industrial Harbor District on the south side of the city. By day, that area was where cargo trucks came and went without pause. At night, it was deserted, with only the dull yellow glow of streetlights and a few small diners still open for night shift workers. Perry parked in front of a diner, tucked against a street corner. It had inside, there were 4 plastic tables, a ceiling fan turning slowly, and the smell of hot food rushing out from the kitchen door in the back. Perry stepped in. There were still 2 customers in the diner, sitting quietly at separate tables, eating. No one looked up when Perry entered. The owner was an older woman standing behind the counter, wiping a glass, her eyes turned toward the door. When she saw Perry, she nodded, signaling that he could sit wherever he wanted. Perry chose a table against the wall and sat down. "Got anything left to eat?" Perry asked. "Red beans with rice. Fried chicken's gone. Give me an order of red beans." The owner turned back into the kitchen. A few minutes later, a plate of white rice with a bowl of smoked red beans was brought out. No decoration, no garnish, nothing except rice and beans. Perry looked at the bowl of red beans. They were dark brown, thick and rich, with a faint smoky scent mixed with onion and garlic. He scooped up a spoonful, brought it to his mouth, chewed slowly, then stopped. Perry wasn't a man who knew fine food. After 20 years eating at Sheridan's restaurant, he was used to expensive dishes, but he'd never truly cared which one was better than another. To Perry, eating was eating, but this bowl of red beans made him reach for a second spoonful right away, then a third, then a fourth. Not because he was hungry, but because there was something in that bowl of red beans that made him want to keep eating. It wasn't elaborate, wasn't strange, but it tasted right. Right in a way he couldn't explain. He only knew it was right. Perry finished every last bite, set the spoon down, sat still for a while. Then he called the owner over. "Who cooked this?" The owner looked at Perry, a little surprised, because this big silent customer hadn't said anything since he came in, and now he was asking exactly that question. "The girl who helps in the kitchen. She cooks the stews. I handle the fried chicken and the fried stuff." "Where is she?" The owner turned her head and pointed toward the kitchen door. Perry followed her gesture with his eyes. Through the small opening, he saw a woman standing in front of the sink, her back turned to the dining room, washing dishes. Her hair was tied high, an apron wrapped around her waist. She didn't know someone was watching her. Perry looked for a few more seconds. Then he turned back, pulled out money, and placed it on the table, several times more than the price of the meal. He stood and walked to the door. He didn't say another word, didn't go into the kitchen, didn't ask her name, didn't introduce himself. The owner looked at the stack of money on the table, then looked toward the door. The black SUV had already rolled away into the darkness of the harbor district. Behind the kitchen, Jolene Ward was still standing there, washing dishes. She didn't know that just a moment earlier, someone had eaten every bit of her red beans and decided he would come back. The next morning, the alarm clock rang at 6 o'clock. Jolene had already been awake for 15 minutes. She stood in the kitchen, a hot skillet on the gas stove, cracking 2 eggs into a bowl before pouring them into the pan. The sizzling sound of the eggs filled the small third-floor apartment in an old building near the harbor district. The apartment had only one bedroom, a small kitchen pressed close to the living room, and a bathroom just large enough for one person to stand in. Jolene put 2 slices of bread into the toaster, poured milk into a plastic cup with a yellow duck printed on it, then set everything on the dining table. The dining table was really just a small wooden table pushed against the wall, barely big enough for 2 chairs. "Mabel, wake up and eat breakfast, baby." The sound of small feet padded out from the bedroom. Mabel appeared in the doorway, half awake, her hair tangled, clutching a small pillow in her arms. The little girl climbed onto the chair, looked at the plate of eggs, then looked at her mother. "Here are your eggs, here's your toast, here's your milk," Jolene said, pushing the cup of milk closer to her daughter. "Eat it all for me, okay?" Mabel picked up her fork, scooped up some eggs, and ate obediently. Jolene leaned back against the kitchen cabinet, drinking a cup of black coffee she had made in a hurry. She watched Mabel eat. The little girl ate slowly, blinking between bites because she was still sleepy. Jolene looked at the clock on the wall. 6:20. The morning shift started at 7 o'clock. "Mom, what is it, baby? Are you coming home early tonight?" Jolene set the coffee cup down. Mabel asked that question almost every morning. And almost every morning, the answer was the same. "I'll try." Mabel didn't ask anything else. The little girl nodded, scooped up another bite of eggs, then lifted the cup of milk and drank, as if that answer was enough, as if she had grown used to those 2 words a long time ago. Jolene turned away, washed the pan, wiped down the stove, then went into the bedroom to change. She put on jeans and an old t-shirt, then tied her hair high. When she came back out, Mabel had nearly finished eating. The cup of milk was more than half empty, too. "Good girl," Jolene said, wiping her daughter's mouth with a paper towel. She lifted Mabel down from the chair, picked up the little girl's bag, then took Mabel's hand and led her outside. The third-floor hallway was quiet and empty. Jolene stopped in front of the apartment across the hall and knocked 3 times. The door opened. Mrs. Glenda, her neighbor, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and a floral nightgown, looked at Mabel and smiled. "Come here to Grandma. I'm making cake today." Mabel let go of her mother's hand and ran into Mrs. Glenda's apartment. Jolene watched her go, then turned to the older woman. "I'll be late tonight. 2 shifts." Mrs. Glenda nodded. "I know. Don't you worry. Go to work. She'll be here with me." Jolene thanked her, turned around, and went down the stairs. She walked quickly, not because she was late, but because if she walked slowly, she would turn back to look at Mabel one more time. And every time she looked back, it became a little harder to keep going. Once she reached the street, Jolene walked to the bus stop. The Memphis morning was already beginning to turn hot. She stood waiting for the bus, looking down at the sneakers whose soles had worn thin. The morning shift at Mrs. Glenda's diner ran from 7 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The evening shift at the diner near the harbor ran from 5 o'clock until midnight. Between the 2 shifts, Jolene had 2 hours. During those 2 hours, she usually sat in the back of the diner, closed her eyes, and tried to sleep for whatever minutes she could steal. The bus arrived. Jolene stepped on, swiped her card, and sat in the last row. She closed her eyes as soon as she sat down. Not because she was sleepy, but because if she opened them, she would think again about Mabel's question that morning. "Are you coming home early tonight?" And she would think again about the answer she knew wasn't true, but still said every day. That evening's shift ended at 11 o'clock. The last 2 customers had left half an hour earlier. The owner turned off the lighted sign outside the door, collected the money, then slung her bag over her shoulder and went home, telling Jolene to lock the door after she finished cleaning. Jolene nodded. She stood in front of the sink, hot water running, a sponge in her hand as she scrubbed every pot, every pan, every plate. All the lights in the front of the diner had been turned off. Only the fluorescent bulb in the kitchen remained, casting a harsh white glow. Jolene washed dishes in a steady rhythm, without needing to look, her hands moving automatically, as if the habit had settled into her bones. She thought about Mabel sleeping at Mrs. Glenda's place, thought about this month's rent bill, still only half paid, thought about Mabel's shoes, already too tight, and the new pair she still didn't have the money to buy. The dishwater kept running. Jolene kept scrubbing. Outside, The sound of an engine stopped in front of the diner. Jolene didn't pay attention. In the harbor district at night, trucks still pulled over from time to rest. But then the doorbell rang. Jolene looked up. Through the small opening between the kitchen and the counter, she saw a large man step inside. The man stood in the middle of the diner, looked around once, then stared straight toward the kitchen window. "We're closed," Jolene called out, the sponge still in her hand. "I'm not here to eat." Jolene turned off the faucet. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out of the kitchen. The man stood there, almost a head taller than she was, broad-shouldered, his face calm. She knew right away he wasn't a truck driver or some passing customer, but she wasn't afraid either. At 11 o'clock at night, at the end of her second shift of the day, Jolene didn't have any energy left for fear. "What do you need?" she asked. The man took a thick white envelope from inside his jacket and placed it on the counter. "My boss needs someone to cook for him tonight. One meal. Just one meal." Jolene looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the man. "Who's your boss?" "You only need to cook." Jolene said nothing. She looked at the envelope again. It was thick, thicker than any envelope she had ever seen. The man continued, his voice even, not rushing her. "The money in there is 3 times your monthly pay. Cook one meal, then you go home." Silence. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Water dripped from the faucet behind her, not fully tightened. Jolene reached out and picked up the envelope. She didn't open it to count. She felt its thickness with her fingers. Then, inside her head, the numbers began to move. This month's rent, short $400. New shoes for Mabel, $35. Milk, food, electricity, water, 2 shifts a day, 6 days a week, and it still wasn't enough. This envelope was 3 times her monthly pay. One meal to cook. Jolene set the envelope down on the counter. "Where would I be cooking? I'll take you there. When you're done, I'll bring you back." "Who am I cooking for?" "You'll know when you get there." Jolene looked at the man. He didn't seem threatening. He didn't smile, didn't plead, didn't explain anything more. He only stood there, waiting for her to decide. Jolene looked down at her own hands. They were still wet, still covered with soap bubbles. She thought about Mabel sleeping at Mrs. Glenda's place. Then she thought about the question from that morning. "Are you coming home early tonight?" Jolene took the envelope and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. She turned back into the kitchen, switched off the light, untied her apron, and hung it on the hook, then stepped outside. "Go. Just one word. No more questions." She got into the mini car. Perry sat behind the wheel and started the engine. The SUV rolled through the night, leaving the harbor district and heading toward downtown. Jolene sat in the back seat, her back against the leather cushion, her eyes turned toward the window. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know who this man's boss was. But in the pocket of her apron, there was an envelope of money worth 3 months of pay. And Mabel's shoes were already too tight. Sometimes, the reason people step into a completely unfamiliar world isn't because they're brave. It's because they no longer have enough money to stay in the old one. The elevator stopped on the highest floor. The doors opened onto a short hallway, and at the end of it was a single dark wooden door. Perry walked ahead, opened the door, and motioned for Jolene to go in. Jolene stepped across the threshold and stopped. The penthouse was vast, with high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling glass windows looking out over the entire Memphis skyline at night. The furniture was expensive, arranged with perfect order, but nothing carried the warmth of human life. No family photographs, no shoes left messily by the door, no half-finished glass of water on the table, clean and cold, like a showroom in a magazine. Perry led Jolene through the living room, turned left into the kitchen, and there, Jolene saw him. Knox Sheridan was sitting at the dining table at the far end of the kitchen. In front of him was a glass of red wine and a phone lying face down on the table. He didn't look up when Jolene walked in. "Cook," 2 words. No greeting. No introduction. No asking her name, where she came from, or what she knew how to make. Just 2 words. Then he took a sip of wine, his eyes still turned toward the glass windows. Perry nodded to Jolene, then stepped out and closed the kitchen door behind him. Jolene stood in the middle of the unfamiliar kitchen. This kitchen was bigger than her entire apartment. The marble countertops gleamed. The set of knives mounted on the magnetic rack looked more expensive than 3 months of her rent. Induction stove, double oven, built-in range hood, everything was new, everything was modern, Everything looked as if no one had ever used it. Jolene opened the refrigerator, almost empty. A tray of fresh chicken, a few onions, garlic, butter, a small carton of heavy cream, a few eggs. In the freezer, there was a little smoked bacon. In the dry goods cabinet above, there was cornmeal, flour, salt, sugar, baking powder, and pepper. Nothing fancy. No special ingredients at all. Jolene closed the refrigerator. She looked around the kitchen one more time. Then she understood. The man sitting over there had enough money to buy anything in the world, but his refrigerator looked like hers. Jolene didn't ask Knox what he wanted to eat. She had no menu. She only knew how to cook one way, the way her grandmother had taught her. She took out the tray of chicken, washed it clean, and chopped it into pieces of the right size. She set a pot on the stove, added butter, and waited for it to melt. She diced the onions and crushed the garlic. When the butter began to foam, she added the onion. The sizzling sound rose through the silent kitchen. The smell of fried onion began to spread, light, sweet, warm. Jolene stirred the onions with a wooden spoon, waiting until they turned translucent before adding the garlic. She cooked by instinct, without needing to measure, without needing to watch the clock. Her hands knew when the onions were soft enough. Her nose knew when the garlic was fragrant enough. Her grandmother had never used measuring cups or measuring spoons. She used to say, "Stop when it feels right." The chicken went into the pot, skin side down, and the sizzling grew louder. Jolene left it alone, didn't stir, waited until the chicken skin turned golden and crisp before turning it over. While the chicken cooked, she mixed cornmeal with flour, cracked the eggs, poured in the heavy cream, added salt and a little sugar. She stirred it into a smooth cornbread batter, poured it into a hot buttered cast iron pan, then put it into the oven. She set the pot of red beans to simmer separately. Red beans, chopped smoked bacon, onion, garlic, chicken stock, cooked over low heat, covered, leaving time to do the rest. The kitchen began to come alive. The smell of hot butter mingled with the smell of pan-seared chicken, the cornbread in the oven, the red beans simmering gently. Those smells didn't belong in the cold penthouse at the top of Memphis. They belonged in small kitchens, in winter afternoons, in a grandmother's wrinkled hands stirring a pot of beans. Knox was still sitting at the dining table. He didn't turn around to watch Jolene cook, but at some point, he had set his wineglass down, and he was sitting still, only listening. Listening to the sound of the knife against the cutting board, the sound of boiling water, the soft ticking of the oven. 40 minutes later, Jolene carried the food to the table. A plate of garlic butter pan-seared chicken, a bowl of smoked red beans, and a hot pan of cornbread, golden and crisp on the outside, soft and tender inside, steam rising from it. No decoration, no garnish, no sauce traced along the edge of the plate, just food. Jolene set everything down on the table, then stepped back and stood 2 paces away. She didn't know what to say. She also didn't know what this man wanted. She had only cooked what she knew. Knox looked at the food. Then he broke off a piece of cornbread, dipped it into the bowl of red beans, and brought it to his mouth. He chewed, slowly, swallowed, then stopped. Knox said nothing. He sat still, looking at the bowl of red beans, looking at the pan of cornbread. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Jolene stood waiting, her heart beating faster, but her face showing nothing. She was used to waiting, waiting for the bus, waiting for a shift to end, waiting for the end of the month to get paid, waiting for Mabel to grow a little older so life might become a little less hard. Waiting a few more seconds didn't frighten her. Knox scooped up another spoonful of red beans, then another piece of chicken, then another piece of cornbread. He ate slowly, but he didn't stop. When more than half the plate of chicken was gone, and there were only 2 pieces of cornbread left in the pan, Knox set down his spoon. He looked up, looking straight at Jolene for the first time since she had entered this kitchen. "You come back tomorrow." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. It was an order. The same way he had spoken to the man asking for more time on his debt the night before. The same way he had said, "Fire the chef." But his voice when he said this sentence was slightly different. A little softer, only a little. Jolene nodded. Jolene returned to the penthouse the next evening, and the evening after that, and the evening after that. Every night was the same. Perry picked her up in the ground floor lobby at 9 o'clock, took her up in the elevator, and opened the penthouse door. Jolene went into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and cooked. Knox sat at the dining table and ate. Jolene cleaned up, and Perry drove her home. Almost no words passed between Jolene and Knox. He didn't ask what she was cooking. She didn't ask what he wanted to eat. She looked at what was in the refrigerator and decided for herself. One night, she cooked salty braised chicken wings with ginger. One night, she cooked pork stewed with white beans. One night, she only made chicken porridge with fried onions, as simple as it could be. Knox ate everything, every night. He never praised it. He never criticized it. He only finished eating, then pushed the plate away. And every night, when Jolene was getting ready to leave, Knox said the same sentence without looking up. "Tomorrow." Jolene nodded and stepped out. Perry took her down to the lobby and drove her back to the harbor district. For 12 minutes in the car, the two of them hardly said anything. Perry wasn't a man who liked conversation, and Jolene didn't have the energy to talk to anyone after 2 work shifts and 1 more cooked meal. She sat in the back seat, closed her eyes, and only opened them when the car stopped in front of her apartment building. By the 8th night, everything changed. That day, the afternoon shift at the diner ended earlier than usual because there weren't many customers. Jolene arrived in the building lobby at 8:30, half an hour earlier than always. Perry hadn't come down to pick her up yet. Jolene called Perry, and Perry told her to come up first. He was upstairs. She stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the highest floor, and the doors opened onto the familiar hallway. The dark wooden door was slightly ajar. Jolene walked into the living room and stopped. From the room inside, behind a closed door, Knox's voice carried out. It wasn't the quiet voice that said tomorrow every night. This voice was lower, slower, one word at a time, clear, as if he were placing stones on a table. "I ask once. I already asked. And I don't ask a second time." Silence. No one answered. Or maybe someone did, but too quietly for Jolene to hear. Then came the sound of a chair scraping against the floor, the sound of footsteps. The room door opened. 2 men walked out. The first man was around 40, wearing a suit, but his tie had been loosened, his face pale, his eyes fixed straight toward the front door, not turning back, not looking to either side. The younger man behind him walked faster, his hand trembling slightly. Both of them passed Jolene, who was standing in the middle of the living room. No one looked at her. No one said anything. They went straight to the door, stepped into the elevator, and disappeared. Jolene stood there, still holding the bag with her apron inside. She didn't know who those 2 men were. She didn't know what Knox had said to them beyond the sentence she had heard. But she had seen their faces. And she understood that the man who sat at that table eating dinner every night wasn't just the owner of a restaurant chain. Perry appeared from the hallway and walked quickly toward Jolene. "You're early?" he asked, his voice normal, as if nothing had just happened. Jolene nodded. Perry looked at her for 1 second, then said, "Go into the kitchen. Just cook like always. It has nothing to do with you." Jolene went into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, took out the food, set a pot on the stove. But when she held the knife to cut the onions, her hand moved more slowly than usual. Not because she was tired, but because she was listening to see what else there was behind the kitchen door, on the other side of the living room, somewhere inside this enormous penthouse that she still didn't know. 40 minutes later, Jolene carried the food to the table. Knox was already seated in his usual place, a glass of red wine in front of him, his face calm, as if nothing had happened. He ate, like every night, slowly, silently, finishing everything. But that night, as Jolene stood waiting for Knox to finish so she could clear the dishes, she looked at him differently, not with fear, not with hatred. She only looked at him and knew that the man sitting in front of her wasn't as simple as a dinner meal. Knox set down his spoon. "Tomorrow!" Jolene nodded, gathered the dishes, then stepped outside. Perry was waiting in the hallway. He walked with her to the elevator and pressed the button down to the lobby. When the elevator doors were about to close, Perry took a small piece of paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to Jolene. "My number. If anything happens, call." Jolene took the piece of paper. She looked at Perry. "What kind of anything?" Perry didn't answer. The elevator doors closed. Jolene stood inside the elevator, holding the small piece of paper with a phone number written in ballpoint pen. She folded it and put it into her pants pocket. She didn't know why Perry had given her his number. but she kept it. Because 27 years of living in Memphis had taught her one thing. When someone hands you a rope without explaining why, you take it. When the time comes, you'll understand what it was for. That evening, Jolene cooked chicken porridge, the simplest of all the dishes she had ever made in that kitchen. Shredded chicken, thin slices of ginger, green onions, and broth made from bones simmered slowly. She ladled the porridge into a bowl, carried it to the table, and set it in front of Knox. Knox ate, like every night, silently, slowly, finished it all, pushed the bowl away. Jolene cleared the bowl, washed it clean, dried her hands, and untied her apron. She folded the apron neatly and placed it on the kitchen counter, then stepped into the dining room. Knox was still sitting there, a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes turned toward the windows. The Memphis skyline glittered in the distance at night, but the dining room was dark. Only the light above the dining table shone down, just bright enough for them to see each other's faces. Jolene walked past the dining table, heading toward the door. She had taken 2 steps when she stopped. She didn't know why she stopped. Maybe because the room was too quiet. Maybe because every night she walked past this dining table, saw Knox sitting there, then walked away, and every night there was only one person at that table. Jolene turned back. "Do you eat dinner alone every day?" Knox didn't look up. He turned the wine glass lightly in his hand, watching the dark red liquid run along the curve of the glass. "I eat every meal alone, not just dinner." His voice was ordinary, not sad, not complaining, not explaining. He was only stating a fact, the way someone might say the weather was hot today, or the diner in the Harbor District closed at 2 o'clock in the morning. Jolene stood there for one more second. Then she gave a faint nod, turned around, and walked out the door. Perry drove her home like always. In the car, Jolene sat quietly, looking out the window. Memphis night drifted past outside. She said nothing. Perry didn't ask anything either. The next evening, Jolene arrived at the penthouse on time. She went into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. That day, there was beef and potatoes. She made beef stew with potatoes and carrots, Southern style, the broth thick and rich, with a little dried thyme she found in the spice drawer. But unlike every other night, Jolene took out 2 bowls instead of 1. She ladled out 2 portions, carried both of them to the dining table. One bowl she placed in front of Knox. The other she placed on the opposite side. Knox looked at the second bowl. Then he looked up. Jolene pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She didn't ask for permission, didn't say, "May I sit here?" She only sat down, picked up her spoon, and began to eat. Knox looked at her. 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Jolene didn't look up. She lowered her head and ate naturally, as if this were her own table and she sat there every night. Knox said nothing. He picked up his spoon, scooped up a spoonful of beef stew, and brought it to his mouth, and the 2 of them ate. No one said a word. There was no music, no television, only the sound of spoons touching bowls, the soft sound of chewing, and the steady ticking of the wall clock from the living room. Outside the kitchen door, Perry leaned his back against the hallway wall. He heard the sound of 2 spoons instead of 1. He tilted his head and looked through the narrow gap of the half-open door. There were 2 people at the dining table. Knox sat at the head of the table. Jolene sat across from him. No one was talking. No one was looking at each other, just eating. Perry watched for a few more seconds. In 20 years walking beside Knox, Perry had never seen anyone sit in that chair. Not because Knox forbade it, but because no one dared. No one ever thought of pulling out a chair and sitting down across from Knox Sheridan to eat with him, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. But the woman sitting there was doing exactly that, and Knox said nothing. Perry turned away. He walked quietly toward the living room, sat down on the sofa, and looked out through the glass windows. He didn't need to watch anymore. He had already understood enough. In the kitchen, Jolene finished her bowl. She stood, gathered both bowls, and took them to the sink to wash. Knox remained seated, a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes turned toward the windows. He didn't say tomorrow like every night. He didn't say anything at all. But when Jolene walked past the dining table one last time to leave, he said, his voice soft, almost too quiet to hear, "Thank you." Jolene stopped for 1 second. Then she kept walking toward the door. She didn't turn back, but the corner of her mouth lifted slightly, very faintly, very quickly, before the elevator doors closed. Dale Whitmore had cooked for Knox Sheridan for 6 years. 6 years standing in the kitchen of Sheridan's restaurant. 6 years designing menus. 6 years hiring people, firing people, changing dishes with the seasons, controlling every plate of food that left the kitchen before it was carried to a guest's table. Dale had graduated from the Culinary Institute of America, had worked as a prep cook, and then sous chef at 2 Michelin-starred restaurants in New York, before returning to Memphis to take the head chef position at Sheridan's. He was good. He knew he was good. And in those 6 years, Knox Sheridan had never once said the word delicious. Not once. Dale noticed it during the first year. He cooked a perfect filet mignon. Knox ate it, nodded, and pushed the plate away. He cooked lobster grilled with garlic butter. Knox ate it, nodded, and pushed the plate away. He made a chocolate soufflé that melted on the tongue. Knox ate it, nodded, and pushed the plate away. It was always a nod. Never delicious, never good, not even fine. Dale told himself that Knox was simply that kind of man. He didn't praise anyone. That was his nature. It wasn't Dale's fault. But after 6 years without praise, any excuse wears thin. And then, 3 weeks earlier, Dale began to notice something unusual. Every week, Sheridan's restaurant ordered ingredients through a private supplier for both the restaurant and Knox's penthouse. Dale controlled the orders because that was the head chef's job. He knew what Knox ate at home, how much he ate, and which ingredients were ordered. 3 weeks earlier, the ingredient orders for the penthouse dropped to 0. No more orders. Knox still ate at the restaurant at lunchtime, but not dinner. And the ingredients were no longer being ordered through Sheridan's. Dale called the building's food delivery man and asked one question. Has anyone been ordering food up to the top floor penthouse? The answer was simple. Yes. Basic ingredients, chicken, vegetables, beans, flour, butter, were being delivered every day. And every night, a woman came to the penthouse and left late. Dale set the phone down. He sat in the small office behind the restaurant kitchen, looking at the Culinary Institute diploma hanging on the wall, looking at 3 photographs of himself with famous chefs in New York, looking at the bookshelf packed with books on French cooking techniques. 6 years. 6 years he had stood in Sheridan's kitchen, cooking every dinner for Knox as if it were a competition, trying every day, changing the menu every week, importing ingredients from France, from Japan, from Italy, only to receive a nod and nothing else. And now, Knox had hired someone to cook at home, someone who didn't order ingredients through Sheridan's, someone who used chicken, butter, beans, flour, the cheapest things, the things Dale wouldn't even bother using in his own kitchen. Dale stood, stepped out into the kitchen, and looked at the team of 12 cooks working under him. He looked at the row of gleaming stainless steel stoves, looked at the industrial ventilation system, looked at the freezers filled with imported ingredients worth tens of thousands of dollars every month. All of this, 6 years of effort, education, experience, technique, reputation, and Knox Sheridan had passed over all of it to eat dinner cooked by an unknown woman using chicken and beans. Dale picked up the kitchen knife, then set it down. Picked it up, then set it down again. His hand gripped the handle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't yet know who that woman was. Didn't know her name, didn't know her face. But he knew one thing. She was standing in the place Dale believed belonged to him. And Dale Whitmore wasn't the kind of man who watched someone take what was his and did nothing. It took Dale 2 days to find Jolene. It wasn't hard. He asked the building delivery man. The delivery man asked the lobby security guard. And the lobby security guard remembered the face of the woman Perry brought upstairs every night. From there, tracing backward, Dale learned that she came from the Southern Harbor District and worked as a kitchen helper in a working-class diner that stayed open late. That afternoon, Dale drove down to the Harbor District. He parked a short distance from the diner and sat in his car, watching. The diner was small, with 4 plastic tables, a ceiling fan, no sign, and a glass door with a cracked pane taped over. Most of the customers were harbor workers and truck drivers, sitting down to eat quickly before leaving. Dale got out of the car. He was wearing a white dress shirt, slacks, and leather shoes, looking completely out of place in the industrial harbor district. He pushed the door open and stepped into the diner at its busiest time, around 6 o'clock in the evening, when the workers had just gotten off their shifts. All 4 tables were full. Loud conversation, the sound of knives and forks, and the owner's voice calling out orders carried into the kitchen. Dale stood in the middle of the diner and looked around. Then he saw Jolene. She was standing behind the counter, a knife in her hand, cutting onions in front of a wooden cutting board worn thin from use. Her hair was tied high, an apron wrapped around her waist, small beads of sweat on her forehead. She was cutting onions continuously, fast and even, her eyes lowered to the board, not noticing that someone had just come in. Dale stepped up to the counter. He stood directly across from Jolene, separated from her only by the wooden counter. Jolene looked up. The two of them looked at each other. Jolene didn't know who the man in front of her was. "You're the one cooking for Mr. Sheridan?" "Sheridan," Dale asked, his voice loud enough for the people at the nearest table to hear. Jolene looked at him. She didn't answer. Her hand was still holding the knife, but she had stopped cutting. "I'm Dale Whitmore, head chef of Sheridan's. 6 years." Dale spoke slowly and clearly, as if he were reading his name and title off a business card. "I graduated from the Culinary Institute of America. I worked at 2 Michelin-starred restaurants in New York. I cook for the richest people in Memphis every day." He paused and looked around the diner, looked at the 4 plastic tables, the slowly turning ceiling fan, the cracked glass taped over. Then he looked back at Jolene. "And you stand here, in this diner, cutting onions with a dull knife, cooking red beans for harbor workers. No degree, no training, nothing at all." The diner suddenly grew quieter. A few customers turned their heads to look. The owner stood behind him, frowning. Dale didn't care. He looked straight at Jolene. "How long do you think you'll get to cook for Mr. Sheridan? He was eating Michelin star food before you even knew how to hold a knife. You're cooking street food for a man used to first-class restaurants. How long do you think that's going to last?" Jolene looked at Dale. Her face didn't change. She wasn't angry, wasn't afraid, wasn't ashamed. She looked at him the way she might look at a customer who had just walked into the diner and ordered food. Then she lowered her head and continued cutting onions. The knife struck the cutting board, steady, fast, just as it had before Dale walked in. As if he didn't exist, Dale stood there. He waited for Jolene to say something, waited for her to argue back, waited for her to explain herself, waited for her to at least look up. But Jolene didn't look up. She finished cutting the onions, swept them into a bowl, then turned into the kitchen, picked up a plate of food, and carried it out to the customers at table 2. She walked past Dale as if she were walking past a post. She set the plate down, told the customer, "Careful, it's hot," then returned to the counter and went back to work. Dale stood alone in the middle of the diner. Several customers looked at him, then looked away. The owner watched him from behind the cash counter, saying nothing, but her eyes were clear. "If you're not ordering, leave." Dale clenched his hand tightly. He had come here to tell Jolene who she was and where she stood. He had prepared every sentence. He had expected Jolene to get angry, to argue, to cry, or at least to waver. But she did none of that. She only cut onions. And that was worse than any answer, because it meant that to Jolene, Dale Whitmore and the words he had just said weren't worth stopping her hands for. Dale turned around, pushed the door open, and stepped outside. He walked quickly toward his car, opened the door, sat behind the wheel, and slammed it shut. He sat in the car, both hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Inside the diner, Jolene was still standing behind the counter. She finished cutting the last batch of onions, swept them into a bowl, then wiped her hands on her apron. Her hands were trembling slightly, only a little. But she didn't stop. 3 days after that afternoon at the diner, Dale Whitmore stood in the lobby of the building where Knox Sheridan lived. He was wearing a white chef's uniform, the kind he only wore on the most important occasions, pressed flat, buttoned all the way to the collar, with the name Whitmore embroidered in dark blue thread over the left side of his chest. In his hands were 2 large insulated bags, holding ingredients he had personally chosen since morning. Fresh Maine lobster, black truffles imported from France, Swiss Gruyere cheese, Normandy butter, Italian heavy cream. The most expensive things a chef could lay his hands on. Dale walked to the reception desk. The lobby guard looked at him, looked at the 2 insulated bags, then shook his head. "You're not on the list, sir. Call upstairs for me," Dale said. "Call who?" "Perry. Tell him Dale Whitmore wants to see Mr. Sheridan. The guard picked up the phone, dialed the internal number, said a few words, then set the receiver down. Wait here, Dale waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. He stood in the middle of the lobby, both hands holding the insulated bags, while the guard looked at him and the people coming in and out of the building looked at him. Dale didn't sit down. He stood straight, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on the elevator. The elevator opened. Perry stepped out. He walked straight to Dale, looked at the 2 insulated bags, then looked up at Dale's face. What do you want? Tell Mr. Sheridan that his chef of 6 years wants to cook him one final meal. Perry looked at Dale. He said nothing for a few seconds. Then he took out his phone, dialed, and lifted it to his ear. Mr. Sheridan, Dale Whitmore is downstairs in the lobby. He says he wants to cook you one final meal. Silence on the other end of the line. Perry waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Perry had already counted in his head. If Knox stayed silent for more than 5 seconds, the answer was usually no. But on the 6th second, Knox's voice sounded through the phone, light and even. Let him up! Perry hung up, looked at Dale. Follow me. The elevator went up to the highest floor. The doors opened. Dale stepped into the penthouse. He had imagined this home many times, but he had never been invited there. After 6 years cooking for Knox, Dale only knew the restaurant and the restaurant kitchen. The penthouse was territory he had never set foot in. Dale walked through the living room and turned into the kitchen, and he saw 2 things at the same time. First, Knox was sitting at the dining table at the far end of the room, a glass of red wine in his hand, his face expressionless, not standing, not turning around. Second, Jolene was standing at the stove, her back turned outward, her hand stirring onions in a pan. The smell of fried onion, hot butter, and simmering red beans had already filled the kitchen. She was cooking dinner, an ordinary dinner, like every night. Dale looked at Jolene. For the first time, he was seeing the face of the woman he had heard about, searched for, and gone all the way to the diner to insult. She stood there, a wooden spoon in her hand, an apron wrapped around her waist, without looking back. She knew someone had just walked in, but she didn't turn her head. Dale placed the 2 insulated bags on the marble countertop, began opening the zippers, and took out the ingredients one by one, arranging them on the counter. Lobster, truffles, cheese, butter, cream. He laid them out as if preparing for battle. Knox looked at the pile of ingredients on the counter. Then he looked at Dale. You walked into my home uninvited. Knox's voice was slow, every word clear, not loud. Using my kitchen without asking. Dale stood straight, his hand gripping the handle of the kitchen knife he had brought in his bag, not because he wanted to threaten anyone, but because it was habit. A chef's hand always searched for the knife handle when tense. If you hadn't been my chef for 6 years, this conversation would end differently. Knox stopped, took a sip of wine, set the glass down. Cook. But remember, you only get one time. Dale swallowed. He nodded. Then he turned toward the empty side of the kitchen and began opening the package of lobster. Jolene stood at the stove on the other side. She had turned her head to look over from the moment Knox spoke his first sentence. She looked at Dale, looked at the pile of expensive ingredients arranged on the counter, looked at the neatly pressed white chef's uniform with the embroidered name on the chest. Then she looked down at her own hand, the hand holding a wooden spoon, her apron stained with grease, the pan of red beans simmering softly on the stove. She said nothing. She turned back, stirred the pan, and continued cooking an ordinary dinner, like every night. Perry stood outside the kitchen door, leaning his back against the wall, his arms folded. He looked in. On one side, Dale with lobster and truffles. On the other, Jolene with red beans and cornbread. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, only for 1 second. Then his face returned to normal. The penthouse kitchen suddenly became 2 worlds. On the right, Dale took possession of the long marble countertop, laying out his ingredients like pieces on a chessboard. The lobster sat on a tray of ice. The black truffles rested in a wooden box lined with paper. The Gruyere cheese was wrapped in wax paper, and the Normandy butter still carried its French label. Dale opened the personal knife set he had brought with him, 8 knives arranged inside a leather roll, each one gleaming, each one made for its own purpose. He pulled out the fillet knife, tested the blade with his thumb, and nodded in satisfaction. On the left, Jolene stood in front of the induction stove, the pan of red beans simmering softly, the cornbread batter already mixed in a bowl, the cast iron pan buttered and waiting to go into the oven. In front of her was the only kitchen knife she used every night. The knife from this kitchen, not her own, its blade still good, though the handle had grown dull with use. Dale began to cook. He separated the lobster shell with quick, precise movements, every cut landing in the right place, the lobster meat coming away whole and unbroken. He started a stock from the lobster shells while toasting arborio rice in another pan, adding white wine, stirring steadily. The scent of wine rose into the air. The smell of lobster spread through the room, and the Normandy butter melted in the hot pan. Dale cooked as if he were performing. Every movement had rhythm, had purpose, had the confidence of a man who had done this thousands of times. While stirring the risotto with his right hand, Dale glanced toward Jolene. "That knife angle you used when cutting onions earlier," he said, his voice light. The kind of voice someone used when correcting a student's assignment. "It's wrong. Cut like that, and the onions release water before they ever reach the pan. You lose the sweetness." Jolene didn't look over. She opened the oven, slid the cornbread pan inside, and closed the door. Dale stirred the risotto, adding the lobster stock one ladle at a time. "And you don't wear gloves when handling raw meat. Any kitchen with standards would never allow that." Jolene lifted the lid from the pot of red beans, stirred gently, then covered it again. "You're not wearing a chef's uniform either. No hat, no proper apron. In my restaurant, you wouldn't be allowed through the kitchen door." Dale spoke each sentence evenly, not loudly, not angrily, as if he were listing mistakes during a kitchen inspection. He knew Jolene could hear him. He also knew she wasn't answering. But he continued, because every sentence he spoke was a way of reminding her, reminding Knox, reminding himself that he belonged to another class. "Risotto has to be stirred constantly. No stopping. Stop for 1 minute, and it's ruined. This is the most basic technique anyone who has been through culinary school knows." He said that sentence, then looked toward Jolene. His meaning was clear. She hadn't been through any school at all. Jolene held the wooden spoon and stirred the pot of red beans. Her right hand trembled slightly, not because of Dale's words. She had worked the morning shift at the owner's diner from 7 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The evening shift at the Harbor Diner from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock. Then she had come here. Her body had been running for 13 hours straight. A trembling hand was only natural. Jolene tightened her grip on the spoon. Let it tremble. She kept stirring. Dale saw Jolene's hand tremble. He said nothing about it, but the corner of his mouth lifted faintly, the smile of a man who had just confirmed what he already suspected. She didn't belong here. Dale turned back to his risotto. He added the lobster meat, stirred it gently, then shaved black truffle over the top. The strong scent of truffle, damp and earthy, mingled with the melting Gruyere cheese. He tasted it, nodded, added a little salt, then turned off the stove. He spooned the risotto onto a round white plate, arranged the lobster meat on top, shaved another thin layer of truffle over it, added a few drops of olive oil, and placed a fresh thyme leaf at the edge of the plate. The risotto looked like a piece from a food magazine. On the other side, Jolene took the cornbread pan out of the oven. The outside was golden and crisp, with a faint curl of steam rising. She ladled the stewed red beans into a bowl. The pan-seared chicken had already finished cooking, and she cut it into pieces and placed them on a plate. No decoration, no garnish, no trace of sauce around the edge. Only the bowl of red beans, the plate of chicken, the pan of cornbread. Poor people's food, cooked by trembling hands, set on a $1 million table. Dale looked over at Jolene's food. He said nothing, but in his eyes there was something other people might have called pity, though it was really contempt. The look of a man who was certain he had won before the contest had even begun. The 2 meals were carried to the table. On the right, lobster truffle risotto by Dale Whitmore, head chef of 6 years, graduate of the Culinary Institute, a man who had once worked in Michelin-starred kitchens. On the left, smoked red beans with cornbread and pan-seared chicken by Jolene Ward, kitchen helper from a working-class diner in the Harbor District. No degree, no uniform, her hands trembling from exhaustion. Knox sat at the head of the table, looking at the 2 plates of food. He said nothing. He picked up his spoon. Knox picked up the spoon and scooped up a spoonful of Dale's risotto, brought it to his mouth, chewed slowly. His eyes didn't look at Dale, didn't look at Jolene, only looked down at the plate. Swallowed. Then he scooped up a second spoonful, chewed, swallowed, set the spoon down. The technique is flawless. 4 words. His voice was calm, even, as if he were commenting on the weather. It wasn't praise. It wasn't criticism either. It was only an observation. But Dale smiled. In 6 years of cooking for Knox, this was the closest thing to praise he had ever received. Dale stood a little straighter, his arms folded across his chest, his chin lifted slightly. He looked at Jolene, his eyes saying more clearly than any words could. There. Did you hear that? Knox pushed the plate of risotto to the right. Then he pulled the bowl of red beans and the pan of cornbread toward himself. He broke off a piece of cornbread, dipped it into the bowl of red beans, brought it to his mouth, chewed. Knox stopped. Not because it was bad, not because it was good. He stopped the way a man stops when he has just heard a familiar song but can't remember where he heard it before. Only for a moment. Then he scooped up another spoonful of red beans, then another piece of chicken, then another piece of cornbread. He ate slowly. With every spoonful, he chewed more carefully than the one before, not rushing, not stopping, just eating. Dale stood watching. The smile on his face faded. Not because Knox had criticized the risotto. Knox had said, "The technique is flawless." But Knox was eating the other food, eating more, then more again, and he wasn't going back to the risotto. Dale looked at his plate of risotto. It was still almost untouched. Knox had eaten only 2 spoonfuls, enough to make an observation. Then he had passed it over. Perry stood outside the kitchen door, arms folded, his face expressionless, but he was counting how much of Jolene's food Knox was eating. The bowl of red beans slowly emptied. The pan of cornbread had only one last piece left. The plate of chicken was nearly gone. Knox ate it all, finished everything. The bowl of red beans was clean at the bottom. The cornbread pan was empty. The plate of chicken held only bones. Knox set the spoon down. Then he did something Perry had never seen in 20 years. He reached out and pushed Dale's plate of lobster risotto aside, slowly, decisively. Pushed it away until the plate sat at the edge of the table, almost about to fall. Then he let go. The plate of risotto sat there, at the edge of the table, out of place, forgotten among the empty bowls and plates. Silence. The ticking of the clock. The faint hum of the range hood. No one said anything. Dale stood there, his arms now lowered at his sides, no longer folded across his chest. He looked at his plate of risotto sitting at the edge of the table. Then he looked at Knox. Then he looked at the row of empty dishes on the other side. 6 years. 6 years he had cooked for this man. 6 years receiving only a nod. And tonight, he had brought the best he had. Lobster, truffles, perfect technique. And Knox had eaten 2 spoonfuls before pushing the plate to the edge of the table. Dale opened his mouth. "So who do you choose?" His voice tried to stay calm, but there was a crack at the end of the sentence, a small crack. But in this silent room, everyone heard it. Knox didn't look at Dale. He didn't turn his head, didn't glance over, didn't acknowledge the question that had just been asked. Instead, he turned toward Jolene. Jolene was standing beside the stove, still holding the wooden spoon, her back leaning slightly against the edge of the counter. She had stood there in silence the entire time since Knox had started eating. Said nothing, interrupted nothing, only stood waiting, as she did every night. Knox looked at her. Is there more? 2 words, just like the way he said everything. Short, no explanation. But Jolene understood. She nodded, turned back into the kitchen, opened the oven, and took out the second pan of cornbread she had baked as a backup, because she knew Knox ate a lot. She ladled out another bowl of red beans, carried it out, and placed it in front of Knox. Knox pulled the new bowl of red beans toward himself, broke off a piece of cornbread, dipped it into the red beans, kept eating. He didn't look at Dale, didn't look up. As if Dale were no longer standing in the room, Dale watched Knox eat, watched the new bowl of red beans, watched the new pan of cornbread. Then he looked at his own plate of risotto, still sitting at the edge of the table, growing colder, the black truffle beginning to dry, the cheese setting into a thin layer across the top. Perry was still standing outside the door. He looked at Dale. And Perry saw the moment the light in Dale's eyes went out. Not anger, not sadness, understanding. Understanding that 6 years, diplomas, Michelin stars, French truffles, none of it mattered as much as a bowl of smoked red beans cooked by that woman whose hands trembled from exhaustion. Dale unbuttoned the collar of his chef's uniform. Slowly, then he turned around, gathered his knives into the leather roll, folded it shut, picked it up. He walked out of the kitchen, crossed the living room, stepped into the hallway, and pressed the elevator button. He didn't say another word, didn't say goodbye to Knox, didn't look at Jolene. The elevator doors closed. Dale Whitmore left the penthouse, and the pan of cornbread on Knox's table was still giving off steam. Dale didn't go home after leaving the penthouse that night. He drove straight to a bar in Midtown, the kind of place where Memphis restaurant people gathered after the evening shift. Dale sat at the bar, ordered whiskey, and drank the first glass in silence. By the second glass, he started talking to the bartender. By the third, he was talking to anyone sitting beside him. By the fifth, Dale was telling the whole bar. 6 years. 6 years I cooked for him. 6 years. And he threw me out because of some dishwashing girl from the Harbor District. The girl cooks red beans and cornbread. Red beans, cornbread. And he ate every bite, then pushed my lobster plate to the edge of the table. Dale drank more. His voice grew louder and more bitter with every passing minute. He said Knox Sheridan's name in the middle of a crowded bar, as if that name carried no weight at all. As if mentioning Knox in Memphis at night were an ordinary thing. But in Memphis, nothing connected to Knox Sheridan was ordinary. And a bar was not a place where secrets lived for long. The rumor spread, fast. Within 2 days, the story of Sheridan's head chef getting fired because of a kitchen helper from a cheap diner had traveled from the Midtown bar to the ears of people Dale never would have wanted to meet. On the third night after the night at the penthouse, a man sat down beside Dale at the bar. Dale didn't know him. The man wore a leather jacket, his hair combed back, ordered a gin and tonic, then turned toward Dale with a friendly smile. "Heard you used to cook for Sheridan?" Dale was drunk enough that he no longer knew who he should talk to and who he shouldn't. He nodded. 6 years. Must have been rough. He's a difficult man, isn't he? Difficult? Dale gave a harsh laugh. He's not difficult. He has no taste. He chose red beans over lobster. He chose that dishwashing girl over me. The man nodded sympathetically, asked more. Gently, naturally, like a drinking companion sharing confidences at the end of the day. What time did Sheridan eat dinner? How many guards were at the penthouse? What time did that girl arrive? What time did she leave? Did anyone else come and go? Dale answered everything. Every question. Knox's dinner schedule at 9 o'clock. Perry was the only person in the penthouse in the evening. Jolene arrived at 9 and left late. There was only one lobby guard on the night shift. Dale spoke as if he were reading from a timetable he had known by heart for 6 years. He didn't ask who the man was. He didn't think about the consequences. He only wanted to talk, wanted to tell the story, wanted someone to listen and nod, as if he had been treated unfairly. The man bought Dale another drink, patted his shoulder, then left. Dale finished the whiskey, paid, and staggered out to his car. He didn't know that the man who had just sat beside him worked for Garrett Hines, one of Knox Sheridan's biggest business rivals in Memphis. Hines had been trying to get information on Knox for a long time, but no one around Knox had ever let anything slip. Until a drunk chef sat in the middle of a bar and told a stranger everything. 4 days later, the working-class diner in the Harbor District, 6 o'clock in the evening, Jolene was standing behind the counter, cutting onions, preparing for the evening shift like every other day. The owner was sitting at the cash counter. All 4 tables had customers. The glass door opened. 3 men walked in. They didn't look like harbor workers, didn't look like truck drivers. The man in front was tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes sweeping once around the diner before stopping on Jolene. Jolene Ward? Jolene looked up. She didn't know these 3 men. She had never seen them before. "You're Jolene Ward?" The owner rose from her chair. "Who are you people? If you want to eat, sit down. If you don't, get out." The man in front didn't look at the owner. He looked at Jolene, then said in a flat, clear voice, "We only want to deliver a message. Stay away from Sheridan. Don't go to the penthouse anymore. Don't get involved in things that aren't yours." Jolene stood still. The knife in her hand stopped halfway through its motion. Then the second man stepped to the nearest table, picked up a plastic chair, and threw it to the floor. The chair broke. The third man kicked over the plastic table beside it. Plates of rice, bowls of beans, glasses of water spilled onto the floor and shattered with a crash. The customers in the diner stood up and backed toward the door. The owner shouted, but the man in front only raised a hand to signal her to stop. No one touched her. No one touched Jolene. They only smashed things. The second man picked up a chair and threw it at the glass door. The glass shattered, shards falling onto the sidewalk outside. The third man flipped over 2 more tables. Plates and bowls broke across the floor. Red bean broth spread into a dark brown puddle over the tile. 30 seconds. The whole diner was wrecked in 30 seconds. The man in front looked at Jolene one last time. "Remember what I said?" Then all 3 of them turned, walked out the door, got into a car, and left. The diner was silent. The owner stood behind the counter, her hands trembling, staring at the broken glass, the overturned tables and chairs. The food spilled across the floor. The customers had run outside and were standing on the sidewalk, looking in. Jolene stood behind the counter. Her hand was still holding the knife. Her eyes looked straight ahead, looking at the wrecked diner, looking at the broken glass door, looking at the puddle of red bean broth on the floor. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't run. She stood there, still as a post in the middle of moving water. Then she set the knife down, took her phone from her pants pocket, unfolded the small piece of paper she had kept in her wallet since the night Perry gave it to her in the elevator, dialed the number, waited through 2 rings. Perry answered. "Perry, my diner just got smashed." Jolene's voice was calm, so calm that Perry went silent for a second before answering. "Are you hurt?" "No, they only broke things. Stay right there. I'm coming now." Jolene hung up. She put the phone back into her pocket, then bent down, picked up the only plastic chair still intact, and set it neatly upright. Then she picked up a broken bowl from the floor, then wiped up the puddle of red bean broth. The owner looked at her. "Girl, why are you still cleaning?" Jolene didn't look up. "Because the diner's still opening tomorrow, ma'am." Perry drove straight to the diner. He looked at the shattered glass door, the overturned tables and chairs, and Jolene sweeping shards of glass from the floor. He didn't go in. He stood outside and made a phone call. Knox answered after the first ring. Her diner was smashed. 3 men. They broke things and warned her to stay away from you. She wasn't hurt. Silence. On the other end of the line. Perry waited. He heard the sound of a spoon being set down on a table. Light. Slow. Perry knew Knox was eating dinner. Tonight, Jolene hadn't cooked, so Knox was eating restaurant takeout. And now, he was setting the spoon down. "Who?" 1 word. Knox's voice didn't change. It wasn't louder, wasn't faster, wasn't angrier. Still that same voice. But Perry heard what 20 years had taught him to hear. When Knox said less than usual, that was when he was most dangerous. Garrett Hines's men. Silence. 2 seconds. "And where did the information come from?" Perry drew a breath. "Dale Whitmore. Drunk. Talking at a bar. Your schedule. Who comes and goes from the penthouse. The hours." He told everything. Silence again. Longer this time. Perry heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Knox was standing up. "Clear the table. I'm not eating any more tonight." Then he hung up. Perry looked at the phone. He put it back in his pocket and looked into the diner once more. Jolene had finished sweeping the glass and was setting upright the few chairs that were still intact. Her back was straight, her hands moving steadily, her face showing nothing. Perry wanted to say something, but he didn't know what to say. He turned around, got into the car, and drove away. Night slowly settled over Memphis. What happened later that night, no one told. No one needed to tell. In Memphis, there were nights when everything was different the next morning, and no one asked why. That night was one of those nights. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Jolene walked from the bus stop to the diner. She turned into the familiar alley, looked up, and stopped. A new glass door. Clear, clean glass, still carrying the label from the glass shop on the corner. The old door had been replaced with a new aluminum and glass, one that opened and closed smoothly. Jolene pushed the door open and stepped inside. Inside were 4 new sets of tables and chairs. Not cheap plastic tables like before. Wooden tables, solid, with chairs that had thin cushions. The floor had been wiped clean. There was no red bean broth stain spreading across it anymore, no broken pieces of bowl. The diner looked different, cleaner, newer, as if last night had never happened. The owner had arrived before her. She stood in the middle of the diner, hands on her hips, looking around, her face both startled and confused. "The workers came at 4 o'clock in the morning," she said, when she saw Jolene. "I woke up because I heard drilling, ran downstairs and saw 4 workers installing the glass door. I asked who hired them. They said they didn't know. I asked who paid them. They said they didn't know that either. I asked why they were working so early, and they said someone called at 3 o'clock in the morning and paid them triple to finish before 7. The owner looked at Jolene. "Do you know who did this?" Jolene looked at the new tables and chairs, looked at the new glass door, looked at the small 4-table diner that had been wrecked last night, and now looked even better than it had before it was smashed. She knew. She didn't need to ask. 3 o'clock in the morning, triple pay, finished before 7. That was Knox Sheridan's way of saying "I heard" without ever opening his mouth. That was how that man protected someone without ever using the word protect. Jolene didn't answer the owner. She walked into the kitchen, hung her apron on the hook, washed her hands, then started preparing for the morning shift. The owner watched her, shook her head, then turned back toward the cash counter too. In the kitchen, Jolene set a pot of water on the stove. She stood waiting for it to boil, both hands braced against the edge of the sink, looking out the small window behind the kitchen. Outside was the alley, the trash cans, the old brick wall. Everything was still the same, but there was a new glass door, new tables and chairs, and Jolene knew that from last night on, she was no longer just the woman who cooked for Knox Sheridan. She had become someone Knox Sheridan protected. And in Memphis, that meant her life would never be the same as before. 2 days later, everything had settled down. The diner had been repaired. New glass door, new tables and chairs, the floor wiped clean. Customers came back to eat, as if nothing had happened. The owner didn't ask anything else. The harbor workers still came in and ordered red beans with rice, still sat down to eat quickly before leaving. Jolene still stood behind the counter, cutting onions, cooking food, carrying plates out to customers. Everything looked normal, but Jolene wasn't normal. For the past 2 days, she had gone to work, cooked, washed dishes, gone home, picked up Mabel, fed her daughter, and put her to sleep. Every action was correct, complete, just like every other day. But inside her, something had shifted out of place before she had time to look at it. That evening, Jolene picked Mabel up from Mrs. Glenda's apartment. Mabel ran to the door, hugged her mother's legs, and told her that Mrs. Glenda had given her pudding. Jolene lifted her daughter into her arms, kissed the top of her head, and walked back to their apartment. She gave Mabel a bath, put her in pajamas, and placed her on the bed. Mabel lay down, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. "Mommy, tell me a story. Go to sleep early tonight, okay? I'll make it up to you tomorrow. Okay." Mabel rolled onto her side, hugged her pillow, and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowly grew slower, steadier. Jolene sat beside the bed, watching her daughter sleep. She sat there longer than usual, looking at Mabel's face, looking at the tiny hand gripping the corner of the pillow, looking at her slightly open mouth, her soft breathing rising and falling. Then she stood, turned off the bedroom light, and gently pulled the door closed. Jolene went into the kitchen. Habit. Every night after Mabel fell asleep, she usually went into the kitchen to prepare things for the next morning. Cook a pot of porridge ahead of time, boil eggs, wash vegetables. Small tasks that made the next morning a few minutes less rushed. She turned on the stove, set a pot of water on it, took an onion from the bag and placed it on the cutting board, picked up the knife, and her hand trembled. Not the slight tremble from the night she cooked in the penthouse kitchen with Dale standing beside her. Worse than that, trembling so much that the blade touched the cutting board and she couldn't make the cut. Jolene looked at her own hand. Her right hand was holding the knife, trembling. Her left hand held the onion, trembling too. She tightened her grip on the knife handle. The trembling remained. She set the knife down, picked it up, trembling, set it down again. Then she let go of it. The blade fell against the cutting board with a small clack in the silent kitchen. Jolene stepped back from the counter. Her back touched the wall. She leaned against it and slowly slid down. She sat on the kitchen floor, her back against the wall, both knees drawn up, both arms wrapped around them. The tile floor was cold, the kitchen light shone white above her head. The pot of water on the stove began to boil, steam rising softly. Jolene sat there. She didn't sob loudly, didn't cry out. She only sat, arms around her knees, head lowered, breathing. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. One breath at a time, slow and heavy, like someone trying to hold something inside her chest and keep it from spilling out. This was the first time in this entire story that Jolene Ward didn't know what to do. She had known what to do when her ex-husband left long ago, known what to do when she raised Mabel alone, known what to do when Perry handed her the envelope at midnight, known what to do when Knox said, "Cook," known what to do when Dale stood in front of her and belittled her, known what to do when the diner was smashed. She had always known. The next step had always been clear. Stand up, work, cut onions, carry food, wash dishes, go home, put her daughter to sleep, then repeat. But tonight, sitting on the kitchen floor, Jolene couldn't see the next step. She only saw the cold tile, heard the boiling water, and saw her shadow printed against the wall. "Mommy?" Mabel's voice came from the bedroom. Small, sleepy. The habitual call of a child asking for her mother, half dreaming and half awake, turning over in bed and calling once just to make sure her mother was still home. Jolene lifted her head. She looked toward the kitchen doorway, toward the hallway leading to the bedroom, where Mabel was lying under the blanket, hugging her pillow, eyes closed. Jolene wiped her face with the back of her hand, drew a deep breath, then answered, her voice normal, warm, just loud enough to be heard. "I'm here. Go back to sleep, baby." Silence from the bedroom. Mabel had fallen asleep again. Jolene sat on the floor for 10 more seconds. Then she braced her hands on the floor and pushed herself up, walked to the stove, turned off the boiling pot of water, turned off the stove, turned off the light. She went into the bedroom, lay down beside Mabel, and pulled the blanket up. Mabel turned instinctively and pressed close against her mother. Jolene held her daughter and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would decide. But tonight, she only needed to lie here, hold Mabel, and breathe. The next morning, Jolene woke before Mabel. She lay still for a while, looking at the ceiling, then gently loosened Mabel's arms from around her neck, laid her daughter back in the middle of the bed, and pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. Then she got up. Jolene opened the closet. She took out the old suitcase that had been shoved at the bottom of the closet since the day she moved into this apartment. The suitcase was gray, and the zipper was stuck on one side. She had to tug hard before she could open it. She began packing. Mabel's clothes first. A few sets of pajamas, a few t-shirts, shorts, the sneakers that were already too tight and that Jolene still hadn't had time to replace. Then her own things. A few outfits, not many. She had never owned much. Jolene folded each shirt, neat and careful, and placed it in the suitcase. Every shirt she folded was folded like a dinner napkin, precise, without wasting a single movement. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She only packed. The decision had been clear since last night, when she lay there holding Mabel. Memphis wasn't safe anymore. Not because Memphis was dangerous, but because she had stepped into the world of a man who made Memphis dangerous for her. She needed to leave. Take Mabel and leave. Where they would go, she would figure out later, as long as it wasn't here. At the same time, 20 minutes by car from Jolene's apartment, Knox Sheridan was sitting in the black SUV parked in front of the working-class diner in the Harbor District. The diner was closed. The lights were off. The new glass door still had its sticker on it. Inside, it was completely dark. Knox looked at the diner through the car window. He didn't get out, didn't call anyone, only sat there and looked. Perry sat in the driver's seat, looking into the rearview mirror, seeing Knox's face. After 20 years, Perry knew how to read that face. Tonight, that face wasn't angry, wasn't cold. It was empty. The kind of empty on the face of a man who had just realized he could lose something he hadn't known he had. "She may already be gone," Perry said. It wasn't a guess. Perry had called the owner of the diner and asked. She said Jolene had taken the day off and hadn't given a reason. Knox was silent. He looked at the diner for a few more seconds, then said, his voice low, "Home." Perry started the engine and drove back to the penthouse. On the way, Knox didn't say anything. He sat in the back seat, his eyes turned toward the window, watching the streets of Memphis fall away behind them. When they reached the penthouse, Knox stepped inside, walked straight through the living room, didn't stop, didn't turn on the lights. He went into the bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out the lowest drawer. That drawer didn't hold clothes. There was only a small old wooden box inside, its corners worn down. Knox took the box out, set it on the bed, and opened the lid. Inside was a notebook. Its brown leather cover had faded. Its edges were frayed. Its spine cracked. Knox picked up the notebook. He opened to the first page. Handwriting, slanted strokes, blue ink faded with time. The corner of the page had a yellow stain, an old grease mark dried many years ago. The first page held one line, May Sheridan's recipes. This was Knox's mother's recipe notebook, the only thing left of her. Knox had kept it for more than 20 years, since the day she died. The notebook stayed in the lowest drawer of the closet, never taken out for anyone to see, never mentioned to anyone. Perry knew it existed, but he had never asked. No one asked Knox about his mother. That was a place even Perry didn't step into. Knox turned a few pages. Each page was a recipe: stewed chicken, red beans, cornbread, braised pork. Every recipe written in his mother's hand, with pencil notes in the margins. Add salt if the weather is cold. Beans need to soak overnight to soften. Knox likes the burnt part. Knox looked at that last line. Then he closed the notebook, walked out into the living room. Perry was standing there, waiting. Knox handed the notebook to Perry. "Give this to her." Perry looked at the notebook. He recognized it. He knew what it was. In 20 years, this was the first time Knox had taken this notebook out of the drawer. "And if she still leaves?" Perry asked. Knox looked at Perry. His eyes were calm, but there was something behind them Perry had never seen before. "Don't stop her." Perry held the notebook, nodded, then left. 30 minutes later, Perry stood in front of the door to Jolene's third-floor apartment. He knocked. Jolene opened it. Behind her, Perry saw the open suitcase on the floor, clothes neatly folded inside. Jolene looked at Perry. Perry said nothing. He held out the notebook. "He told me to give you this." Jolene looked at the notebook. The faded brown leather cover, the frayed edges, the cracked spine. She took it. It was heavier than she had expected. Not heavy because of the paper, heavy because of what was inside. Perry turned around. "Perry." Perry stopped. Did he say anything else? Perry was silent for 1 second. He said, "If you still leave, don't stop you." Then Perry walked away. Jolene closed the door. She stood in the middle of the living room, the notebook in her hands, looking at the suitcase lying open on the floor. Then she sat down beside the suitcase and opened the notebook. The first page. Handwriting, slanted strokes, pale blue ink. May Sheridan's recipes. Jolene turned the page. Stewed chicken. A pencil note in the margin. Cook on low heat, don't rush. The next page. Stewed red beans. An old grease stain in the corner, yellowed with age. A note. Beans need to soak overnight to soften. The next page. Cornbread. A note. Knox likes the burnt part. Jolene stopped on that page. She looked at the line. Knox likes the burnt part. The handwriting of a mother, recording her son's taste in the margin of a recipe notebook. Simple, ordinary. Just like the notebook Jolene's grandmother once had. Her grandmother had owned a notebook like this too. Leather cover, handwritten words, grease stains, notes in the margins. Jolene likes her red beans with more broth. Add sugar to the cornbread for the girl. That notebook disappeared the same day her grandmother died. Jolene likes her red beans with more broth. Jolene searched the whole house and never found it. She thought someone must have thrown it away with the old things when they cleaned out the house. She had lost her grandmother's notebook, and now she was holding Knox's mother's notebook. 2 notebooks, 2 women, 2 different kitchens, but the same thing. The handwriting of someone gone, recording how to cook for the people they loved. Jolene sat on the floor beside the open suitcase, holding the notebook in her hands, and cried. This time, she truly cried. Not because she was afraid, exhausted, or because the diner had been smashed. She cried because she understood. Understood that that man, the man all of Memphis didn't dare name after dark, had just given her the only thing left of his mother, not to make her stay, but because he didn't know any other way to say that he understood her, that he too had once lost someone like that he too had once had a small kitchen, an old notebook, and the smell of red beans simmering on a winter afternoon. Jolene cried, and the suitcase on the floor remained open, but she didn't put anything else inside. Jolene didn't open the suitcase to unpack. She didn't close it either. She left it lying there on the floor, open, clothes neatly folded inside, all that day and the next day too. She placed the notebook on the kitchen table, beside the salt jar and the sugar jar, where her grandmother used to put her own notebook long ago. That evening, Jolene didn't go to the penthouse. The next evening, she didn't go either. On the third evening, Perry called. Jolene answered. Perry didn't ask whether she was staying, didn't ask whether she had made her decision yet. He only said, "He wants to see you." Jolene was silent for a while. Then she said, "Where?" "Penthouse, 9 o'clock." Jolene arrived at the penthouse at 9 o'clock. Perry met her in the lobby and took her upstairs. The familiar dark wooden door, the familiar hallway, the familiar scent of the penthouse mixed with wood, leather, and today, something more, coffee. Knox was sitting at the dining table. There was no food in front of him, only a cup of coffee. Jolene stepped in and stood a few paces from the dining table, the way she had stood in this kitchen the very first time. But everything was different now. Knox looked at her. This time, he looked at her the moment she walked in, not out toward the glass windows, not down at a plate of food. "Sit." Jolene pulled out the chair and sat down across from Knox. The same chair she had sat down in on her own for the first time on the night she cooked 2 portions of beef stew. The chair no one before her had ever dared to sit in. Knox set his coffee cup down. "I have an offer." Jolene waited. "Become my private chef, officially. A fixed salary, 5 times what you make now at the diner. Stable hours, only dinner, and the rest of the time is yours. You'll have time with your daughter." Knox spoke evenly, clearly, without looking away. He had thought about this offer. He had calculated it. This wasn't an impulsive remark. This was Knox Sheridan making a decision, like every other decision in his life, precise, conditional, with numbers attached. Jolene listened. She looked at Knox, looked straight at him, without lowering her head, without looking away. "No." One word. Knox didn't blink. But Perry, standing outside the door, tilted his head slightly. In 20 years, Perry could count on one hand the number of people who had said no to Knox Sheridan. "I don't want to cook for one person," Jolene continued, her voice normal, not apologizing, not explaining at length. "I want to open a place of my own, a small one. 4 or 5 tables would be enough. A place where people come to eat and feel like they're coming home." She paused for 1 second. "My grandmother cooked for the whole neighborhood. Your mother cooked for you too. Their food wasn't meant to be sold to one person. Their food was meant for anyone who walked through the door." Knox looked at Jolene. His face didn't change. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't frown. He sat still for 3 seconds. Then he pushed back his chair and stood, said nothing, buttoned his suit jacket, straightened his sleeves, then walked out of the kitchen and headed toward the bedroom. The bedroom door closed behind him. Jolene sat alone at the dining table. She looked at the door Knox had just closed. She thought he was angry. She had just refused Knox Sheridan, the man all of Memphis didn't dare say no to. She had just said no and was sitting there waiting for the consequences. Perry stepped into the kitchen and looked at Jolene. "Go home. Is he angry?" Perry looked at her. "I don't know what he is right now, but you should go. Let him think." Jolene nodded, stood, and walked out the door. 4 days. For 4 days, Jolene heard nothing from Knox or Perry. She went to work, came home, picked up Mabel, fed her daughter, and put her to sleep. The recipe notebook still lay on the kitchen table. The suitcase still sat open on the bedroom floor. She didn't close the suitcase, and she didn't take the clothes out. She was waiting. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Jolene was washing dishes at the diner when Perry walked in. He sat down at a table and didn't order any food. He waited for Jolene to come out. Jolene dried her hands and stepped out to the counter. "Perry." Perry placed a small white envelope on the table. It wasn't thick like the envelope of money from the first night. It was thin. Jolene opened it. Inside was a key and a piece of paper folded in half. The key was small, made of brass, new, hanging from a simple key ring. Jolene opened the paper, Handwriting. She recognized it immediately. Not Knox's mother's handwriting from the notebook. This was Knox's handwriting. Slanted, strong, every word written clearly, as if it had been placed on the table. Unit number 7, Lamar Street, near the old neighborhood. The first 6 months' rent has been paid. This isn't a gift. This is an investment. I want table number 1 every Saturday night. Jolene read it twice, then 3 times. She looked at the key in her hand. Small, brass, heavier than she had expected. Then she looked at Perry. Perry looked back at her, his face as calm as always, but there was something warmer than usual in his eyes. He's been looking for a place since the day you turned him down, driving through the old streets every day, looking himself. Didn't ask anyone else, Perry added, his voice quiet. I've followed him for 20 years. I've never seen him look for anything himself for anyone. Jolene held the key, held the piece of paper. She stood in the middle of the 4-table working-class diner, her apron stained with grease, her hair tied high, her hands still wet with dishwater. And for the first time in this entire story, Jolene Ward smiled. Not a wide smile, not a loud one. Only the corner of her mouth curved upward, soft, warm. The kind of smile that belonged to someone who had just seen something she thought no longer existed. That afternoon, after her shift, Jolene took the bus to Lamar Street. She stood in front of unit number 7. Small, old, a rolling metal door, white painted brick walls already peeling, a rusted metal awning. She slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened. Inside was empty. A cement floor, white walls, a ceiling with an old fan. Enough room for 4 tables. There was a doorway leading to the back, where the kitchen would be. Jolene stood in the middle of the empty room, looking around. She pictured 4 wooden tables, chairs with thin cushions, a small counter beside the kitchen door. On the wall, 2 recipe notebooks would hang in glass frames, side by side. One from her grandmother, one from Knox's mother. She didn't have her grandmother's notebook anymore, but she remembered every page. And she had Knox's mother's notebook. 2 notebooks, 2 women, 2 kitchens, the same thing. Jolene looked at the empty room once more. Then she said, softly, only for herself to hear, Maze. Her grandmother's name, the restaurant's name. Maze opened on a Saturday morning in early October. Jolene woke at 4 o'clock in the morning. She stood in the small kitchen behind the restaurant, set the pot of red beans on the stove, mixed the cornbread batter, and brushed butter over the cast iron pan. Everything was something she had done hundreds of times. But this morning, her hands didn't tremble. This morning, she was cooking in her own kitchen. The restaurant was small, with 4 wooden tables, chairs with thin cushions, and a counter beside the kitchen door. The walls were painted white and clean. On the kitchen wall, right where Jolene stood cooking every day, 2 glass frames hung side by side. The frame on the left held a notebook open to the recipe for stewed red beans, with round handwritten letters, faded black ink, and an old grease stain in the corner of the page. It wasn't Jolene's grandmother's real notebook. That notebook had been lost. But Jolene had rewritten it from memory, 1 recipe at a time, in her own handwriting, in a new notebook she had bought. She rewrote it because she remembered every line, every note in the margin that her grandmother had once written. She even recreated the grease stain, rubbing it onto the corner of the page by hand, because her grandmother's notebook had always had a grease stain there. The frame on the right held Knox's mother's recipe notebook. Its faded brown leather cover was open to the cornbread page, with slanted handwriting, pale blue ink, and a pencil note in the margin. Knox likes the burnt part. 2 notebooks hung side by side, 2 women who were gone, 2 kitchens that no longer existed, but their handwriting was still here, on the wall, looking down over the new kitchen every day. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Mabel woke up. Mrs. Glenda brought the little girl to the restaurant early, just as Jolene had asked. Mabel walked in, her eyes round as she looked around. Is this your restaurant, Mommy? Yes, this is Mommy's restaurant. Mommy, can I help? Jolene looked at her daughter. She took a stack of white cloth napkins and placed them on the table. You can help Mommy put the napkins on the tables. 1 for each table, okay? Mabel picked up the stack of napkins, ran to the first table, set one down, and smoothed it flat with her tiny hand. Then she ran to the second table, the third, the fourth. At each table, Mabel stopped to straighten the napkin, tilted her head to inspect it, then nodded to herself before running to the next one. Jolene stood in the kitchen, watching her daughter through the small opening, smiling. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the restaurant opened. The first customer was Mrs. Glenda, sitting at table 3, ordering one portion of stewed red beans. Then came a few familiar people from the old neighborhood whom Mrs. Glenda had invited. The restaurant was small, only 4 tables, so it filled quickly. Jolene cooked without stopping, carried food out, then turned back in to cook more. Mabel ran around between the tables, talking to customers, asking one man whether it tasted good, asking one woman whether she wanted more cornbread. At 11 o'clock, the restaurant door opened. Perry stepped inside. He stood at the door, looking around. Looking at the 4 wooden tables, the white napkins, the ceiling fan turning slowly, the smell of stewed red beans and cornbread filling the whole place. Then he looked outside and nodded. Knox Sheridan walked into Maze. He wore a black suit, his back straight, his face expressionless. The kind of man whose entrance into a room made every conversation go quiet. But Maze didn't go quiet. Mrs. Glenda kept talking to her friend. The customers kept eating. Mabel kept running. This restaurant didn't know how to fear Knox Sheridan. Knox looked around. 4 tables. Table number 1 was right beside the kitchen counter, closest to where Jolene stood cooking. That table was empty. Knox walked over, pulled out the chair and sat down. Then he looked up at the wall behind the kitchen counter. He saw the 2 glass frames, the frame on the right, the notebook with the faded brown leather cover, the slanted handwriting, the pale blue ink, the cornbread page, the note in the margin, "Knox likes the burnt part." Knox looked at that notebook, his mother's notebook, hanging on the wall, inside a glass frame, beside Jolene's grandmother's notebook. He said nothing, only looked for a long time. Then he lowered his eyes and looked at the white napkin Mabel had smoothed flat on the table. Mabel ran to table number 1. The little girl looked at the man in the black suit, not knowing who he was, not knowing what kind of power he carried, not knowing that all of Memphis didn't dare say his name after dark. She only saw a man sitting alone without food. "Sir, my mommy's food is really, really good. You should eat." Knox looked at the child, 5 years old, smiling wide, bright eyes, just like her mother. Knox looked through the kitchen opening and saw Jolene standing inside, cooking. Her hair was tied high, her apron wrapped around her waist, her hand holding a wooden spoon as she stirred the pot of red beans. She looked out and saw Knox. The 2 of them looked at each other through the kitchen opening. No nod, no wave, only looking. Knox turned back to Mabel. "Bring me whatever your mother makes best." Mabel smiled and ran into the kitchen. "Mommy, that man wants to eat whatever you make best." Jolene watched her daughter run in, then looked out at table number 1. She knew what Knox wanted to eat. She set the pan on the stove, brushed it with butter, poured the cornbread batter into the cast iron pan, and put it in the oven. She ladled stewed red beans into a bowl. She sliced the garlic butter pan-seared chicken and placed it on a plate, the dish she had cooked the first night in the penthouse, the dish that made Knox say, "You come back tomorrow." Jolene carried the food out to table number 1, set it in front of Knox. A bowl of red beans, a plate of chicken, a hot pan of cornbread. Knox looked at the pan of cornbread. He recognized it. Perry was still standing outside the restaurant door, his arms folded, his back against the wall. Jolene looked out and saw Perry. "Perry, come sit down." Perry looked at Jolene. Then he looked at Knox. Knox said nothing, but he didn't shake his head. Perry stepped inside, pulled out a chair at table number 1, and sat down. Jolene turned back into the kitchen and carried out 2 more portions, one for Perry, one for Mabel. 4 people sat around table number 1, Knox, Perry, Jolene, Mabel. In the middle of the table were the pan of cornbread, the bowl of red beans, and the plate of chicken. Mabel broke off a piece of cornbread, dipped it into the red beans, and ate happily. Perry scooped up a spoonful of red beans, ate in silence, and nodded. Jolene sat across from Knox, eating slowly, sometimes looking at her daughter and smiling. Knox broke off a piece of cornbread, dipped it into the bowl of red beans, and brought it to his mouth, chewed slowly, swallowed, then broke off another piece. He didn't say, "Delicious," didn't say, "Thank you," didn't say anything at all. He only ate. But he was sitting here, in a 12-square-meter restaurant, at table number 1. with 3 other people. For the first time in a very long time, Knox Sheridan wasn't eating alone, and Jolene Ward wasn't cooking for one person. Outside Maze, the Memphis morning sunlight shone through the glass door, falling over the 4 shadows sitting around the table. And on the kitchen wall, 2 recipe notebooks lay side by side inside their glass frames, looking down over the small kitchen, where the smell of cornbread and stewed red beans was drifting through the whole room, exactly like the smell in the old kitchens of 2 women who had been gone for a very long time. Some stories end with grand promises. This story ends with a meal. 4 people, 1 table, 1 pan of cornbread. And for the first time, no one eats alone. Sometimes, the most precious thing in life isn't power, money, or reputation. It's getting to sit down with someone, share a simple meal, and feel that you belong there. Sometimes, healing doesn't need words. All it needs is a small kitchen, an old recipe, and someone willing to sit down beside you. If this story touched your heart, please hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss new stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep inside your heart. We always read and treasure every line of your comments. We wish everyone watching this video truly good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.